The lock was changed on a Thursday. I know this because the locksmith's receipt was timestamped 9:14 a.m., 2 hours before the first guests arrived for my father's funeral, and 4 hours before Patricia handed me a sympathy card at the door of a house that had been in my family for 31 years and told me that given the circumstances, it was probably better if I didn't come inside. She never checked who was on the deed. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe. Because this one took me 18 months to resolve, and every single minute was documented. I am an estate planning paralegal. I have been one for 11 years. I work with grief for a living, not the emotional kind, although that's always present, but the paperwork kind. The kind where someone dies and the people they loved most suddenly become strangers to each other over square footage and bank account balances. I have prepared thousands of documents. I have sat across from families in conference rooms, while attorneys read the words of people who are no longer in the room to defend themselves. I have watched expressions change in real time when the numbers don't match what someone assumed. I see estates the way a radiologist sees an X-ray. Most people look at the surface. I look at the structure underneath. My father, Robert, was a civil engineer. He built things, roads, bridges, drainage systems for municipalities that would outlast both of us by 100 years. He was precise and patient and had a laugh that sounded like it started from somewhere deep and traveled a long distance before it got out. He kept a yellow legal pad on his kitchen table where he wrote his to-do lists in the handwriting of someone who had drafted blueprints. Neat, tight, purposeful. He married Patricia when I was 22. I was already out of the house, already in school, already building my own life, so the marriage landed softly for me. She wasn't cruel in the beginning. She was simply not my mother. I did not ask her to be. What I asked, in the way you ask without words, was that she love my father well and leave the things that belonged to my family where they were. For a few years she did. Patricia had 2 sons from a previous marriage, Marcus and Dean, who called my father Robert, never Dad, and who came around on holidays with the specific energy of people calculating the distance between themselves and an inheritance. They were pleasant enough at Christmas. They were polite in the way that people are polite when they're waiting for something. My father and I had a ritual. Every Sunday when I wasn't working a deadline, I drove the 40 minutes to his house and we sat at the kitchen table with coffee and his yellow legal pad and we talked through whatever needed talking through. He asked about my cases without asking for details he shouldn't have. I asked about his projects. We did not perform closeness. We simply were close. It was quiet and specific in ours. I noticed when Patricia started sitting at the kitchen table too. I noticed when the yellow legal pad moved from the table to a drawer. I noticed when the Sunday visits started getting shorter, when my father started meeting me at the door instead of leaving it unlocked, when the coffee was already done instead of brewing when I arrived. I filed these things away the way I file everything, not with alarm but with attention. I am very good at attention. My father was diagnosed with a progressive cardiac condition in the spring, 14 months before he died. He told me on a Sunday, at the kitchen table, with his hands flat on the surface the way he placed them when he was delivering information that required no elaboration. He said, "The doctors have a plan." He said, "Patricia knows." He said, "I need to talk to my attorney." He wrote that last part on the yellow legal pad and underlined it once. I did not ask him what was in his will. I never asked him that. I want to say that clearly because later certain people would suggest that I had positioned myself. I had not. I had simply been his daughter consistently for 31 years. That was all I ever was. He died on a Tuesday in October. He was 64 years old. I was at work when Patricia called, and I sat at my desk for 4 minutes before I stood up, and my coworker Dana saw my face and said nothing, which was the correct response. I drove to the hospital. Patricia was there with Marcus and Dean. She touched my shoulder once when I walked in and said he went peacefully, and then she turned back to her sons. I drove home that night and I sat at my own kitchen table and I put my hands flat on the surface the way my father did, and I stayed there for a long time. The funeral was planned for that Thursday. Patricia handled the arrangements. I offered 3 times to help and was told 3 times that she had it. I brought food to the house on Wednesday, a casserole, a tray of fruit, and she accepted it at the door and did not invite me in. I told myself she was grieving. I told myself everyone processes differently. I drove home and I told myself those things until I believed them enough to sleep. Thursday, 9:14 a.m. The locksmith receipt that I would not see until much later, but whose timestamp I would eventually know, the way you know the exact weight of a thing that has been pressed against your chest for a long time. I arrived at noon, 90 minutes before the service. I was wearing my father's favorite color, which is a shade of navy blue that looks black indoors and blue in direct sunlight. I had his service program in my hand, which I had printed because Patricia had asked me, in one of her 3 text messages over the preceding 48 hours, to handle the printing. I had the programs in a tray. I was carrying them to the door. Patricia opened it before I knocked. She was dressed and composed and holding a glass of water, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as having already decided. She said, "I think it's better if you don't come in." I said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "I've talked to Marcus and Dean and we feel like it would be less complicated for everyone if you participated from the chapel rather than the house. There's going to be a small gathering beforehand for immediate family." I stood on the porch of the house where I had grown up and I looked at the woman my father had married and I said, "Patricia, I printed the programs." She reached out and took the tray from my hands. She said, "Thank you," and she closed the door. I stood there for 11 seconds. I counted them. I am a person who counts things. Then I walked back to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and took a photograph of the front door. Timestamp, 12:03 p.m. I did not know why I was taking it. 11 years of professional habit. You document what you witness. You always document what you witness. I went to the chapel. I sat in the 3rd row, not the front. I watched Marcus and Dean and Patricia occupy the front row the way people occupy a space they have already decided is theirs. One of my father's colleagues, a man named Gerald who had known my father for 20 years, sat down next to me and put his hand on my arm and said, "Your father talked about you every week." I nodded. I kept my hands in my lap. The service was what it was. My father's pastor spoke. A recording of a piece of classical music my father had loved was played. There was no eulogy from family. There was a printed program with my father's photograph on the front, the photograph I had selected from the ones Patricia sent me, the one from 3 Christmases ago where he is laughing at something off camera and his face looks exactly like his face. I held the program the entire service. When it was over, I folded it once along the center crease and put it in my coat pocket. I did not go to the reception. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from an attorney named Charles Whitfield, who identified himself as the executor of my father's estate. He said, "Ms. Okafor, when you have a moment, I'd like you to come in. There are some matters we need to discuss." His voice was careful in the way that estate attorneys are careful, every word placed with deliberate weight. I called him back within the hour. We scheduled for Monday. I did not sleep well that weekend. I sat with the program on my kitchen table. I made coffee I did not drink. I thought about the locksmith receipt I didn't know existed yet. I thought about Patricia's face at the door. I thought about my father's hands, flat on the table, delivering information that requires no elaboration. Monday came. Charles Whitfield's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown. He was in his 60s, soft-spoken, with the particular formality of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times it had become a kind of ceremony. He shook my hand and asked if I wanted water, and I said no, and he opened a folder. He said, "Your father was very deliberate about his estate planning. He updated his documents approximately 8 months ago. I want to make sure you understand the full picture before you hear from anyone else." He turned the folder toward me. My father's will was 12 pages. I read it in the way I read every document, slowly in full without skipping. The executor was Whitfield. The primary beneficiary of his financial accounts, his vehicle, and his personal property was Patricia, which I had expected and which was appropriate. His pension survivor benefit went to Patricia as well. And then the house. The house at 4412 Drummond Road, the house where I was born, where my mother had planted the rosebushes that still bloomed every June along the south fence, where my father had kept his yellow legal pads and his engineering drafts and his record collection and 31 years of a life, had been deeded to me. Not left to me in the will. Deeded. Present tense. Past tense. Already done. My father had executed a transfer on death deed 18 months ago. It had been recorded at the county clerk's office. It named me Adiz Okafor as the sole transferee. The moment my father died, the title passed to me by operation of law, automatically without probate. The house had been mine since Tuesday. I turned the page. I turned it again. Whitfield said, "There's also a letter." He slid it across the desk. It was a single page, handwritten on engineering graph paper, the small grid kind my father used for calculations. His handwriting, neat, tight, purposeful. He wrote, "Adiz, I know you will read this carefully and understand what I've done and why. The house is yours because it was always ours, yours and mine, from before Patricia. I am not punishing anyone. I am being precise. I trust you to handle this the way you handle everything. Quietly, correctly, and completely." I read it once. I read it again. I read it a third time. Whitfield said, "There's one more thing." He opened a secondary folder. He said, "Your father had a home equity line of credit, which your stepmother co-signed 18 months ago. The outstanding balance is $47,000. Under the terms of the deed transfer, the property transfers subject to any liens, but the co-signer obligation remains with Mrs. Patricia Okafor, not with the title holder." He paused. He said, "She will need to resolve that balance independently." I sat with that for a moment. $47,000. I turned it over in my mind the way I turn documents over, looking at every angle, checking the math. I thanked Charles Whitfield. I took the copies. I put them in my bag, the letter on top, in the clear sleeve I keep in the front pocket specifically for documents I want to be able to read without unfolding. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table. I put my hands flat on the surface. Then I called my own attorney. Miss Story CT. If you have ever watched people who had no time for your father's Sunday mornings suddenly find themselves very available once the estate was open, you already know what came next. Stay with me. Because Patricia called on Wednesday. Her voice on the voicemail was warm and tired in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed the tired. She said she wanted to talk about the house. She said she knew things had been complicated. She said she was sure my father would have wanted us to handle this like family. She used the word family 4 times in a 90-second voicemail. I did not return the call. My attorney, a woman named Renata who has been practicing real estate and estate law for 22 years, and who once told me that her job is to make sure the paperwork says what her clients mean. Renata sent a letter to Patricia on Thursday. It outlined the transfer on death deed, its recordation date, the property address, and the legal conclusion. The property had transferred automatically upon Robert Okafor's death to Adiz Okafor. It requested that Patricia provide written notice of her intended vacate date within 14 days. Patricia received it on Friday. On Saturday morning, Marcus called me from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I didn't recognize it. He said, "I don't know what you think you're doing." I said, "Good morning, Marcus." He said, "That house is our mother's home. Your father lived there for 12 years with her. You can't just take it." I said, "I didn't take anything." He said, "We have a lawyer too." I said, "I know you do. They'll need to review the deed recorded at the county clerk's office, instrument number," and I gave him the number. I had memorized it. There was a pause. He said, "This is not what Robert would have wanted." I said, "Marcus, what do you think Robert wanted?" He had no answer for that. The silence lasted long enough that I heard him shift the phone. Then he said they were having a family meeting on Sunday and that I should come, and that we should talk this through like adults. I said, "I'll be there." I spent Saturday evening with a folder. It contained the transfer on death deed certified copy, the recordation timestamp, the home equity line documentation, with Patricia's signature on the co-signing agreement, a property tax record showing my name had already been updated, and the locksmith receipt, which Renata had obtained through a discovery request I had initiated the moment I retained her. Timestamp 9:14 a.m. on Thursday, October 12th, the morning of my father's funeral. I also put in the program. The one I had folded along the center crease and carried in my coat pocket. I put it in its own clear sleeve. Sunday. The house at 4412 Drummond Road. I arrived at 2 o'clock and parked on the street, which felt correct. The rose bushes along the south fence were bare in October, but I looked at them when I walked up the path. My mother had planted them in 1991. My father had tended them every spring without being asked. Patricia answered the door. She was composed in a way that had clearly cost her something. Marcus was on the couch. Dean was in the armchair. There was a man I didn't recognize near the window who turned out to be a family friend, not an attorney, which told me something. There was also Gerald, my father's colleague, the one who had sat next to me at the funeral. He was in the corner chair, and when he saw me he gave a small nod. I did not know yet why he was there. Patricia said, "Thank you for coming, Adiz. I know this is hard for all of us." I sat in the chair she indicated, which was across from the couch, facing all three of them, which was meant to feel like a tribunal and instead felt like a presentation. Marcus spoke first. He said, "We want to talk about what's reasonable." He said my father had been with their mother for 12 years. He said the house was her home. He said there were ways to handle this that didn't have to involve courts and lawyers and all of that. He said the word reasonable 4 times in 3 minutes. He had his phone out and I watched him check it once, which meant his own attorney had prepared talking points. Patricia said, "I just want to understand what Robert would have wanted for all of us." Dean, who almost never spoke, said, "You were barely here the last few years anyway." The room got quiet when he said it. Even Patricia looked at him. I waited. Then I said, "May I show you something?" I put the folder on the coffee table. I did not open it yet. I said, "I want to start with something my father wrote." I took out the letter from its clear sleeve. I said, "This is dated 14 months ago, written in his handwriting on his graph paper." I read one line. "The house is yours because it was always ours." I set it back in the sleeve. Patricia's jaw moved once. I said, "The transfer on death deed was recorded at the county clerk's office 18 months ago." I opened the folder and placed the certified copy on the table. I named the instrument number aloud. I said, "The recording timestamp is on the bottom right." I did not point to it. I let them look. Marcus said, "Deeds can be contested." He said it like he had been told to say it. I said they can. I placed the property tax record beside the deed. I said, "As of last week, the county assessor's office has updated the title record to reflect the transfer. That process takes approximately 5 business days. It has already completed." Dean said, "This is," and then he stopped. I said, "The home equity line of credit." I placed that document on the table. I said, $47,000, outstanding balance, co-signed by Patricia 18 months ago. The property transferred subject to existing liens, but the co-signer obligation is Patricia's independent of the title. Renata's letter to your attorney will have explained that. I know you received her letter. Marcus stood up. He said, "You can't come in here and..." I said, "I can ask you to let me finish." He sat down. I said, "There is one more thing." I took out the locksmith receipt. I placed it on top of the deed. I said, "This is the receipt for the lock change performed on this property on October 12th at 9:14 a.m., 2 hours before my father's funeral. 4 hours before I was told at the door of my own house. And I want to be accurate here, I said own. I said it once and I did not repeat it, that I should participate from the chapel." Patricia said, "I was grieving." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't know about the deed." I said, "I know you didn't." The room was very quiet. The family friend near the window had not moved. Marcus was looking at the documents on the table. Dean had his arms crossed and was looking at the carpet. And then Gerald from the corner chair said, "Robert told me about the deed." He said it quietly, in the way of someone honoring a confidence he had been released from. He said, "He told me about it the week he executed it. He wanted someone outside the family to know." Patricia looked at Gerald for a long moment. I picked up my father's letter. I put it back in the clear sleeve. I put the clear sleeve in the folder. I stood up. I said, "Renata's letter asks for a vacate date within 14 days. I want to give you the full 14. I want the transition to be as uncomplicated as it can be. I picked up the folder. Patricia said, "He never told me." I said no. He didn't. I walked to the door. I looked once at the mantel, where there was a photograph of my father and Patricia from a trip they had taken, and next to it, slightly behind it, a photograph of my father and me at my college graduation, partially obscured. I did not move either photograph. I said, "The rose bushes need to be cut back before the first frost. If you'd like to do that before you leave, I'd appreciate it." I walked out. I did not look back at the house when I got to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and I took one breath and then I drove. Final CTA. Patricia vacated on day 12. She took what was hers under the personal property provisions of the will, which was most of the furniture from the rooms they had shared, and a number of items that were not hers but that I allowed her to take because my father had loved her once and that mattered. I had the locks changed by a different locksmith. The receipt is timestamped 4:41 p.m. on a Friday in November. I keep it clipped to the original receipt, the 9:14 a.m. one, in a single clear sleeve. The home equity line was Patricia's to resolve. She resolved it over 9 months in payments, which I know only because the lien had to be cleared from my title, and my attorney confirmed when it was done. I did not ask for anything beyond what was already owed. Marcus hired an attorney who sent 2 letters. Both letters were answered by Renata with copies of the recorded deed, and the county assessor's updated title record. There was no third letter. Marcus has not contacted me since. Dean, to his credit, sent me a text 4 months later. It said, "I'm sorry for what I said at the funeral." I did not respond, but I did not delete it either. Gerald came to the house in December at my invitation, and we drank coffee at the kitchen table. He told me 3 stories about my father that I had never heard. I wrote them down on a yellow legal pad. I still have the legal pad. It lives in the kitchen drawer where my father kept his. The house is exactly as it was mostly. I moved some things. I kept the record collection where it was. I kept the photograph from my college graduation on the mantel, moved to the center, visible now. I kept the photograph of my father and Patricia too because it is a photograph of my father and he was happy in it, and that belongs in the house as much as anything else does. In the spring I cut back the rose bushes. In June they bloomed. My father's letter lives in the clear sleeve in the front pocket of my work bag. I have read it perhaps 40 times. The line I read at the table, "The house is yours because it was always ours," is not the line I return to most. The line I return to most is the last one. He wrote, "I trust you to handle this the way you handle everything. Quietly, correctly, and completely." I have thought about that word, completely, many times since. I think he meant it the way an engineer means it, not just done but structurally sound. Built to hold. Not revenge. Not victory. Just a thing that was true, made legally indisputable, documented, and resolved. Calm is not the same thing as weak. My family had confused the two for a long time. They had mistaken my patience for surrender, my consistency for compliance, my presence every Sunday for something that could be revoked with a changed lock. They had not checked who was on the deed. They had not checked a lot of things. If this story reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts, and that what's yours does not become negotiable simply because someone needs it to be, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Know what your name is on. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.